Museums. Every year, thousands of visitors come to New York City in search of the ancient, the magnificent, the unusual. And among the city's finest exhibits, there is a place where history talks.
The first time man has been able to sit at home and look at two oceans at the same time. We're impressed with the importance of this medium. We shall hope to learn to use it and not to abuse it.
I did. And as I
Here at the Museum of Broadcasting, you'll find a very special window to the past.
The Bob and Ray burglar kit.
Back seats, wherever you're going, I'm not going that way.
It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the National Bank holiday.
The museum houses over 25,000 television and radio programs representing 60 years of American broadcasting history, from some of the first to the best of today's programming. And it's all available to the general public. Like any institution of its kind, the museum is constantly looking for other treasures, lost programs, and special performances. Scheduled events include daily screenings of select programs in the museum's amphitheater, and a rare and special series of seminars featuring some of the most famous and influential performers and journalists in the history of broadcasting. Tonight, in that same tradition, the Museum of Broadcasting, in cooperation with Merrill Lynch, is proud to bring you 60 Minutes, creating a tradition.
Good evening. I'm Bob Bottcher, the president of the Museum of Broadcasting, and this week in New York we're honoring 20 years of 60 Minutes. And I want to thank Merrill Lynch for enabling us to take one of these seminars and satellite it to over 75 cities across the country. I'd like to thank the 60 Minutes people for helping us this week and participating in a series of seminars, and for being here this evening to take the questions from around the country. And let me first introduce the people who are with us this evening. First, on my far left, Morley Safer, Diane Sawyer, Don Hewitt, the executive producer of 60 Minutes, Mike Wallace, Ed Bradley, and Andy Rooney. And before we go to the questions, we've tried to put together some highlights of 19 and now 20 years of 60 Minutes. And if we could have the tape, please.
When 60 Minutes debuted on September 24th, 1968, a new tradition of news presentation was created. The television magazine format was born, as well as a unique way of looking at contemporary history and culture.
Good evening. This is 60 Minutes. It's a kind of a magazine for television, which means it has the flexibility and diversity of a magazine adapted to broadcast journalism.
Each week, 60 Minutes gets more than 1,000 letters, none more poignant than those describing miracle cures for cancer and other diseases. But lately, we've gotten a surprising number telling us about a particular cancer clinic at a spa in Murrieta Hot Springs, California. To find out what it was really like, we told them 60 Minutes sound man James Camery was a wealthy, semi-retired investment counselor who had just learned he had leukemia. The 60 Minutes team enrolled soundman Camery in the Murrieta Cure program without revealing their identity, and they secretly filmed and recorded as much of the routine as possible.
60 Minutes has explored the inner workings of the military.
And come aboard the U.S. destroyer Maddox as 60 Minutes tries to reconstruct what really happened August 4th, 1964 in the Gulf of Tonkin. The incident that was to Vietnam what Pearl Harbor was to World War II.
Will you welcome, please, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Herbert.
As millions of viewers watched Lieutenant Colonel Herbert describe one of the war crimes he said that he had witnessed in Vietnam.
He had a woman by the hair with her head bent back, and he had his right arm around her throat with a knife dug in right here. And there was a child holding her leg, screaming, and they had the second child buried face down in the sand with his foot on his head, suffocating him.
And you say it was your insistence on having war crimes investigated that led to your relief from command, right?
I still say it.
Did Colonel Herbert ever report war crimes or atrocities of any nature to you, Colonel Franklin?
No,
Never.
never.
At 84, the Admiral retains the famous style: combative, challenging, deliberately provocative.
No, I never have thought I was smart. I thought the people I dealt with were dumb, including you.
I'll tell you, to be called dumb by you is to be in very good company. Edward R. Murrow, for one, I think you said he asked you stupid questions.
Well, I told him the same. I told him he was asking stupid questions, and he agreed. He says, well, what question should I ask? And I told him.
If the people who work in the Pentagon really know their way around the building, they don't explain it very well to strangers like myself. Now, what do these signs mean?
Well, different colors, you know, where you want to go, whatever.
Well, what do you mean in different corridors?
We got 6 quarters, 6.5, 10 quarters, you know, quarters go all the way around.
And that's how you get around?
Right.
There are 10 corridors labeled 1 through 10, and 730 means it'll be right off the 7th corridor.
The easiest way is to go down the A ring.
Which is what ring am I in now?
You're in the E ring.
And then I go back 5 rings and turn left or right?
You would turn right.
Go back to D ring, which is toward the inboard side of the building. I mean, toward the center of the building. That'd be 1 ring from E ring, D.
And there'll be a stairway. You go straight on downstairs, sir. This is the 4th deck, next one down be the 3rd.
And that would be near 700?
I don't know that, sir. All I know is it's the 3rd deck down.
By the way, while we're here, could you tell me how to get to 2D 704?
60 Minutes has presented unflinching portraits of crime and scandal.
Not since Joe Valachi has there been an informer like Jimmy Fratiano. And not since The Godfather have you heard stories like his. Jimmy, who was the first person you killed?
Frankie Nicoli.
Where'd you kill him?
In my house.
How'd you kill him?
We strangled him. I took a guy out of Vegas one time and killed him. Just took him out of the Desert Inn. You know, there's different ways, different methods.
You were a good killer.
I just had the talent to do things like that.
In one 6-day period, while we were in Palermo, they played the same scene 9 times. When the police got where they were going, they always found another victim of the war among the mafia.
How much does it cost to get a man killed in Palermo?
I heard that someone just was satisfied with 300,000 liras, which would be $300. Maybe a little less.
This is the time of the year when television broadcasts are nominated for the coveted Emmy Awards, and we would like to take this opportunity to make a nomination of our own. For his appearance on this broadcast 9 weeks ago, 60 Minutes nominates Clifford Irving as Best Actor of the Year in a starring role. Where did you happen on these transcripts?
I got the transcripts from Howard Hughes.
I wonder if you would...
And there's more to it than that. The quality of what this man told me, we hacked this thing out over a period of months.
How many months?
I would say 6 months. And what this man went through to give me this material, that is to say, his soul searching and his going back over incidents and trying to explain to me and trying to dig into his past and desperately trying to get at the truth of his own life.
Why?
Because he feels he has been maligned. He feels people have told lies about him for years.
Now, I'm going to level with you. I made a lot of money. You know, not a fortune, but more than most people. In 35 years, I suppose I've made $1,250,000. In addition to all these items, I guess I've paid about $400,000 in taxes. So that's a grand total that I've spent of $1,067,375. Now, tell me this. If I've made $1.25 million and I've spent $1,067,000, what the heck did I do with that other $183,000?
60 Minutes continues to examine the seeds of international conflict.
Just outside Belfast, we saw some of the weapons recently captured from the IRA. So far, they include 25 of these Soviet-made rocket-propelled grenade launchers. Is this change from American-made to Eastern Bloc weapons just a coincidence? Not according to Peter McMullen.
He was a top soldier with the IRA from 1971 to 1978.
They had started to get involved with other groups, Baader Meinhof, the Red Army, PLO.
You know, there are a lot of people in this country who would find that hard to believe.
A lot of people in Ireland would find it hard to believe, too.
As a group, they still talk bitterly about U.S. support of the Shah. Yet, when you walk down the street in a city like Tehran, individual Iranians send friendly signals.
No Farsi.
Excuse me, what were you taking this film?
I'm an American, and for American television. What do you think of the United States?
It's much better than Iran.
It's much better than Iran, the man said before he disappeared into the crowd.
Is one of the United States' best friends using American weapons to suppress human rights in his own country?
They filled his body with 50 bullets, and after all that, they didn't want to give me the cadaver.
Would you step down if President Carter asked you to do so directly?
Only if he would, if I asked him to.
It's a long way from the days Imelda Marcos was a power to be reckoned with in the Philippines. She held the titles Governor of Metropolitan Manila and Minister of Human Settlements. She controlled a lot of government jobs and government money. As for her money and her taste, by now almost everybody's heard about the opulent bedroom, decorated in the style of Marie Antoinette. Not to mention the row after row of expensive dresses and the famous shoes, nearly 3,000 pairs of them.
I have no weakness for shoes. I wear very simple shoes, which are palm shoes. It is not one of my weaknesses.
Questions of justice and responsibility are regularly deliberated by the 60 Minutes team.
John Mitchell and Bob Haldeman went to jail last week because of the Watergate job bungled by this man, Gordon Liddy. He's still in jail, but may be heading for parole. He has talked publicly only once.
What's your opinion of John Dean? And what do you think his motive was?
Save his ass.
Did you really threaten to kill Jeb Magruder?
I think that's one of the few truthful statements that Jeb Magruder has made.
I have absolute 100% confidence in the conviction of Linnell Jeter as being the correct person who robbed 5 people at gunpoint in a Kentucky Fried Chicken store in Balk Springs, Texas.
The day after that, Linnell Jeter was arrested and was tried swiftly, found guilty, and sentenced to life for the Kentucky Fried Chicken robbery at Balch Springs. How did it all happen? Could Linnell Jeter have been a successful engineer who went out to rob fast food restaurants on his lunch hour, or coffee breaks, or after work? It all happened with the armed robbery of this Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Greenville, Texas, on August 9th, 1982, by a young black male. Carla Wright worked in this restaurant. Was that the man who held up the Kentucky Fried Chicken?
No, sir.
Is that the man who held up the Kentucky Fried Chicken? So you're absolutely, what, 100% positive it was not Linnell Jeter who held up that restaurant?
Absolutely.
After I stabbed him, he started walking backwards.
The last time they put Jack Abbott in jail, there were those who said they should have thrown away the key. They didn't. Despite a history of violence inside the walls of the several penitentiaries that had been his home since he was a teenager, Jack Abbott was paroled. He was paroled partly because some prominent authors were impressed with the book he had written. But Jack Abbott may never come out of prison again. Between the time he committed this senseless murder and the time he was sentenced, we talked with him in jail. Tonight, a conversation with the killer who doesn't understand why society wants to lock him up forever.
60 Minutes has interviewed many of the world's great artists and performers.
I think that fighting with somebody you love and are really sure of, and if you're really sure of yourself in your love, I think having a fight, an out-and-out, outrageous, ridiculous fight, is one of the greatest exercises in marital togetherness. I think
especially if you have no really weak points.
Oh, I see.
You see, you do not attack the weak points. They're perfectly obvious in Elizabeth and myself. So when I insult Elizabeth, which I frequently do, I do not attack that soft spot in the underbelly. And when she attacks me, double chins.
You bloody well have.
Yeah, she's got a slightly fat belly. I never
Well,
use
I've got
those
his
things.
pockmarks, you know.
We must reform, and I don't know how we're going to reform. We're sitting looking at a lot of filth. And I'm disgusted with the movies, disgusted, because they're kidding themselves into saying it's a sort of intellectual pastime. Bunk! It's 42nd Street filth. Filth being sold for too much. And now it's respectable to go and see them. And the critics, I think, have lost their minds. And how can it be stopped? They say, oh, no censorship. No, freedom of the press. The hell with that. They've got to do something.
I know you're not advocating
shoot all the
censorship,
people. Oh, don't be too sure.
I'm sorry, it's regrettably easy for me, because now, in my crusty old age, I'm almost exactly like him. I haven't the majesty, of course, but I have every other characteristic of Lear. Unreasonable, impossible, stupid, stubborn, and I'm sorry, that's me. In Hamlet's time, I was much more like Hamlet. I had all those qualities, all the weaknesses particularly. And I think if you can recognize, I think that's a little secret for the actor. Use your weaknesses. Aspire to the strength.
Bewitched, bothered, and bewildered.
You once said somewhere you didn't want to be an older woman singing songs about sex and all that stuff.
And I don't really, if I can avoid it now.
When you sing Bewitched, Bothered, and
Well,
Bewildered,
but it's funny to me, don't you think so? Didn't you feel sorry for that old broad falling for that old young thing?
when you say that I'm a rich, juicy, ripe plum again,
Yeah, but you can't help your sexual nature, you know. That's what that line means. If a lady treats other people as she'd like to be treated, then she's allowed to go and roll in the grass if she wants to.
even if she's 64.
Even if she's 64. Particularly then.
I'm Mike Wallace.
I'm Morley Safer.
I'm Harry Reasoner.
I'm Ed Bradley.
I'm Diane Sawyer. Those stories and Andy Rooney.
The Museum of Broadcasting's tribute, 60 Minutes Creating a Tradition, salutes this award-winning series as it enters its 20th year.
It's an incredible program and with an incredible group of people. We're going to go directly to questions, and we'll start with the audience. There's a question here in the audience.
At the beginning of the tape we just saw, Harry Reasoner described 60 Minutes as a sort of magazine of the year. I'm fascinated to know what the editorial process is like. What are the criteria for a story, and how do you put the mix of stories together that make a 60-minute show?
Don?
Sheer chaos. We've been on the air 20 years, and in 20 years we've had one editorial meeting, and that's because we all hollered at each other and we didn't want to ever meet again. This is the loosest shop in town. The editorial process, most people don't believe. It's Mike bursting into my office and saying, "Hey, kid." Mike calls everybody kid. I think Mike called his father kid. And it's, "Did you see the story in the Times this morning?" Well, in the third paragraph, there's something that it'd be interesting to follow up. Or it's Diane walking in and saying, "Listen, somebody told me last night, thus and so. Do you think that would be something we should do?" Or Harry, or Ed, or Morley, and it's out of that crazy... Harry's home. Harry Reasoner's not here tonight. It isn't that he doesn't like us, it's that he's recuperating. And out of this crazy, sort of informal style, they come up with stories, the producers that work with them come up with stories. A lot of stories come from viewer mail. About 1/4 of what we do now comes from ideas that come from viewers. And that just starts the ball rolling and people going out on stories. let me just interrupt for one second. The word producer is a misnomer. Nobody in television news is a producer. David Merrick is a producer. Darryl Zanuck was a producer. We're all in the news business. There are 25 people we call producers, 5 correspondents. There are actually 30 reporters. These 5 do the reporting on air because they broadcast better than the others. But it's a process that defies description.
I'd like to answer that question, too. I know how it happens, too. Don has these 5 correspondents. He's got to juggle them around, and he's got stories, different type stories, and you can't have 2 same type story on. And they argue, and they fight about which story is going to go on, and this goes on for days, and finally said, we got to drop Rooney this week.
I was going to say the only thing wrong with his account is that after I go in and say, I heard something great last night, Mike comes back in and says, you know, I can do that story better than the kid can.
The nicest thing about working at 60 Minutes is that in the editorial process, there is no assignment editor. No one parcels out stories. No one says, Diane, this is a story you should do, or Mike, this is a story for you. We all come up with the teams we work with our own story ideas. And that's the nicest thing about it.
One of the difficulties, and maybe one of the strengths of the broadcast, is that you present these ideas to Don. And Don has an attention span of something less than a hyperactive poodle. And if you don't grab that attention in the first, I was going to say 10 seconds of this conversation, the story will never happen. So you kind of, I suppose we can say, we have to hype the stories. We really have to hype the stories to him. And then you get his attention. And if you don't get his attention and you still stay there, refuse to leave, and stay and stay and stay, out of sheer boredom, he'll say, go ahead and do the story.
Now you're going to do the story. So you turn it over to one of the producers, the reporters, and they go and do the donkey work. They go and do a lot of the hard work that has to be done to research. And they'll spend a week or 2 or 3, 4 weeks out in the field. Come back and talk to each one of us, depending upon who they represent, and say, look, this basically is what the story is. Is it interesting? Do you really want to do it? And then it becomes a kind of collaborative process between the producer and the correspondent. We'll work for 4, 6, sometimes 8 weeks on a story, put together what is called a rough cut, and eventually bring it back to this fellow who had commissioned or had okayed the story in the beginning. And that's when he gets back into the process and decides what works, what doesn't work. And from there we go to the so-called fine cut, which is what you people see on the air.
Let's take a call from Washington, D.C., the group that's with WUSA. Do you have your question?
Yes, I do. I'm interested in how each of you would determine what makes or does not make a particularly good story, or who is involved in that decision-making process. Do each of you go out and find ideas and then come back and how would you sell it to your colleagues?
You know, I've always felt that the way Justice Brennan described pornography. I feel the same way about a good story. I don't know how to define it, but I know it when I see it.
It's a good story is the one that makes you say, holy, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. I really didn't know that that took place. The best story is the one that makes the audience say, I had no idea that that went on.
It's also, none of the people here, or Harry, ever go out on a story they don't want to do. I mean, the key ingredient, really, early on, a key ingredient, is the correspondent. He's got to want to do the story. He's got to be fired up about the story. Now, we've all started out fired up on a story, lost interest halfway through, and very often those stories don't get on the air for very good reason. And sometimes they do get on the air, and we wish they hadn't been on. But that ingredient of getting the correspondent steamed about the story is the most important part of getting the story ultimately on the air.
But after 20 years of doing it, roughly, how often are you wrong now? How often do you actually go through a story, complete it, bring it back in, and you're wrong.
Less often than I used to be. I think, or maybe I'm just lulled into some sense of whatever, I don't know. But I think, well, what's interesting, though, about 20 years, and Mike and I talk about this a lot, I'm surprised that I get steamed up about stories still. And it's a wonderful feeling to know that you can still get excited about this
It's
job.
what makes the weekends, as you well know by now, Diane, it's what makes the weekends on the airplanes and the lack of sleep and all that travel and all the jet lag, it's what makes it worthwhile. It's when all of a sudden you get caught up in the excitement of the story itself.
Let's take a question from Cincinnati, the group with WCPO. Question, please.
Yeah, we would like to know if Andy Rooney has gotten a lot of flack for honoring the picket lines during the writers' strike.
None whatsoever, and absolutely none. Yes, I have. Is that an answer?
San Francisco, KPIX. Go ahead.
Yes. Are there any stories you have had regrets, doubts, or second thoughts about?
Yes, several. Several that I've had two that I've filmed in 6 years with this broadcast that didn't make air, that we went out and shot. We researched, we shot it, we came back, edited it, wrote it, and screened it, and they never aired. Basically, the story wasn't there, and it shouldn't have been aired. It shouldn't have been shot in the first place. And there was another story that did air, that sat on the shelf for a long time, and I think I finally suggested to Don that it be aired on the Sunday of the Super Bowl in the year that CBS didn't have the Super Bowl, so not many people would see it.
Anybody else have an example?
You know, the business of not being happy with the story that you've done and putting it on the air very, very seldom happens because there is a kind of fail-safe procedure. By the time that you get through the story with your own producer and then bring it to Hewitt, or bring it to Phil Scheffler and to Hewitt, Phil Scheffler being the senior producer of the broadcast, and him. And they'll go through it and try to fine-tooth comb it and decide if it's good, if it's accurate, if it's fair, if it's interesting. And after that, it goes to the vice president in charge of 60 Minutes at CBS News. By the time it goes through that screening process, if it doesn't make it through the screening process, it's not very good. Once it does, by and large, unless we are looking for a story to burn, as he says, against the Super Bowl when the Super Bowl's on NBC, we're pretty satisfied, reasonably proud of the stuff that we turn out.
I think there's one thing that occurs in a lot of stories, and it's not regrets about doing the story. You're very pleased you did the story, and you're quite pleased with the result of the work. But you wish, what makes a good story is something that's easily told and plainly told. You wish there was a little more room sometimes for the grays in a story, for the flourishes that will maybe complicate it a little bit, but ultimately explain a bit more. And very often, the very nature of this broadcast, the very nature of television, you can't do that.
Well, that's the subtleties that Hewitt takes out in the screening.
Mainly.
I was going to say,
that's his job.
I thought Morley was the only one who got to do that.
One of the reasons the scrappage rate is so low, our producers are excellent. And a good producer is not only someone who can produce a good story, it's someone who has the sense to call in from the field and say, hey, you know the doctor we're going to do the story on? I just met him. Forget it. This guy's from nowhere, and we really don't want to do it. And to know, one of the tricks of television news is to find people who can tell their own story very well. People who other people are interested in. You find people who can write beautifully, you find people who've won all kinds of awards, but they're not much at telling their own story. And if a producer's good, he or she will phone in and say, hey, let's scrap this one before we even shoot any film.
But the question was also about regret. I mean, do you regret having done Clifford Irving?
No. I mean,
You believed him. You really did. You believed him. Now don't tell me you didn't. I had a fight.
The truth.
I had a
They
fight.
both. The truth is, they both believed it.
No,
that
you're absolutely right.
There's
You're
a better
absolutely
part to the
right.
story. That afternoon, when they came back, he came back.
Now, he
from
was there.
When they came back from interviewing Clifford Irving, both high on getting Clifford Irving. Nobody else got Clifford Irving. I was standing
Clifford Irving was Howard
around
Hughes' best friend.
the hovel that was then our office, and a couple of the guys in the crew came in, and I was having a drink of soda pop with these guys in my office, which is the only place then you could get soda pop. And I said, "What'd you think?" And they said, "Forget it.
This is the
The
crew."
whole thing is a lie." But these two.
No. At lunch, I said to Clifford Irving, remember we had lunch at Ackerman's house, and I said to him, "You're a phony. This is a big lot of baloney. You read a book by a guy named Elmer Dahuri, who did a story about art fraud, and you decided you were going to do a literary
Why wasn't that
fraud."
the lead to the story?
Wait a second. Why did you put it on the air if you were so
Because
sure?
there was such a great phony well, we knew it was phony before we put it on the air, and we put it on the air anyway.
Oh, we did.
Well, they obviously agree. So let's go to Houston, to KHOU. Your question?
Our question over here in Houston from KHOU TV is how are 60 Minutes correspondents chosen? What are the criteria? And also, how often has some information been cut from a story that you felt should have been presented to the public?
We're chosen for our looks.
We're chosen the way they said at the top of this broadcast. They choose items for museums: the ancient, the magnificent, and the unusual.
Don?
Yeah. Any good medium, I don't care if it's a theater, journalism, newspapers, magazines, radio, or anything, the essence is always, hey, tell me a story. And these people tell you a story better than anyone else I know. And it's almost that simple. And if you try to gum it up with all sorts of reasons why, or all sort of journalistic stuff here or there, that's not it at all. They are wonderful storytellers. Both true stories and make-believe stories, Mike. And, kid. And that's really how they were chosen.
None of these answers have anything to do with the facts. They just seem as though that's what the answers ought to be to these questions.
I'm reading it off cue cards.
How are they chosen?
All right, Rooney,
Rooney,
answer it.
Answer it.
Answer it.
How did you get chosen?
You drop around from time to time. Answer it.
How the correspondents
How
are
did you
chosen?
get chosen?
I fought my way in over your dead body, practically.
All right.
Let's take a question from North Carolina, UNC. Question, please.
Yes, in my own experience as a journalist and in the experience of other journalists I know, there are few black reporters at any level of any of the media. There are also very few black journalism students. Given the media's years of focus on civil rights, why are blacks so poorly represented in the media's own ranks? And what should be done to change this, if anything?
I have, before you answer, it's an
Was it
interesting thing.
automatic?
He didn't put the question in here.
I can see you chairman of the bed. I think the problem is that I think all the bright guys coming out of the better colleges can get much better paying jobs than they can in journalism. And it's tough to kind of get somebody away from Merrill Lynch where they can make a lot more money than they can as a lowly reporter in either a newspaper or television. Look, hey, Joe, what are you doing here? Joe Water works for us, just graduated from Yale. But you're going on to bigger and better things, right, Joe? Yeah. Yeah. See?
I reject the premise that there aren't many black reporters in television. I think there are quite a few.
Well, yeah, quite a few compared to 20
Compared
years
to the
ago.
number of blacks in America, yeah.
No, compared to 20 years ago, quite a few. 20 years ago, there were virtually none. When I started at WCBS Radio in this city, I was the only black reporter on that station. It's changed today. There was only one at Channel 2, at WCBS television, and it's changed today. But I think in the late 60s, there was an emphasis on the part of broadcasters to find qualified minorities and give them an opportunity. And I think, frankly, there's less of an emphasis today.
There may be less of an emphasis, but I still think there is a terrible competitive thing where the bright black kid coming out of Yale or Harvard or Princeton or wherever is more attracted to banking or law.
Well, there's
or
another.
finance,
I was
he gets
talking
paid better.
to Oz Elliott, who is the dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, about this once. We were on a panel, and he said he gets approached every year about his crop of graduate students who are going to go out looking for jobs in journalism, and places like Associated Press, New York Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, starting off with the first rank of big city newspapers and wire services, want to get the bright young minority journalists who are coming through probably the best journalism school in the country. And they vie for them, and they get them, and they usually go to the Times or the LA Times. And the average stay, taking Don's point, is about 3 or 4 years. And then they go on to the Merrill Lynches and the Mobil Oils and work in public relations and go for where there is genuine opportunity. Within journalism, there really, in terms of money and position, there are very few jobs for anybody, black or white.
But I
And
think
in
you'll
the
agree,
field of
Warren,
commerce,
in
there
New
are
York
many
City-
more
In
spaces.
New York City, for instance, on television, we're loaded.
If you look at absolute numbers and you look at percentage of the population, minorities in this country, and you look at the percentage of minorities on news staffs, you'll find that they're not the same. The percentage is much lower on the news staff.
Even in New York City?
Even in New York City.
They put a lot of them on the air out front then.
A disproportionate number are on camera. Disproportionate number of black people are on camera to the numbers.
Behind the scenes?
No, to the numbers of blacks there are in the United States.
Both, and behind the scenes, both.
Oh, behind the scenes, no.
And on camera, no.
I disagree with you.
Well, I can give you the numbers and prove you.
Get one of your
right.
reporters to find out for you. I'll find out for myself.
Let's take a question.
That's the real Andy Rooney. What you see is what you get.
Let's take a question from the audience here. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question. When a group of you all were fighting off one of the takeovers a couple of years ago, and you were putting together your assets, and you succeeded, not putting together your assets, but you succeeded. Have you got any new places to put your money now? Are you going to go into Time Inc. or Turner or anyone else?
First of all, that wasn't our money. It was somebody else's money. You're talking about the bid to buy CBS News?
That's it, yeah.
Listen, we don't have enough money to go buy tomorrow morning's New York Times. No, it was somebody else that said he would put up the money, and we put up the ideas, and we're kind of glad they never accepted our offer, because if they had, we wouldn't be here tonight. We'd be having budget meetings deciding who we had to fire.
Let's take a question from Shreveport, KSLA. You a question, please? Shreveport, are you there? No? Then let's go to Wichita, to KWCH.
Good evening. Your investigative reporting through the years has undoubtedly caused a lot of feathers to be ruffled. Have any of you ever been accosted or threatened as a result of these reports?
Never. What you see in the picture, however, what you see in your set is not what's really behind the scenes. You see, when you're off doing an interview or doing some kind of a stand-upper, there is a cameraman, a sound man, an electrician, and a fellow with a large monkey wrench. And on a couple of occasions, actually, that sort of thing has taken place. By and large, the astonishing thing is that when you ask a good, tough, carefully researched question, people do not object to it. We don't have to subpoena people to come on this broadcast. They know, by and large, what it is that we do. And once they've decided that they're going to come on, then they are willing to answer the questions that are put to them.
Weren't you threatened once?
The I was not really threatened. Burt Lancaster, when I did an interview show a million years ago, walked out on me in a huff. And I got the impression that conceivably he would have liked to chew me up and spit me back, but barring that, no.
From Las Vegas, KLAS. Could we have a question?
I'm looking at your show, and I would like to know how many shows that you have in advance, and who makes the decision on changing shows, say, before a broadcast on something of interest that's happened that week?
We produce individual stories, and once a week we assemble 3 of them into a broadcast. And the assembling of the piece into a broadcast is the easiest thing you do. You know, you throw in that silly stopwatch and you put it all. It's like glue. It's producing those stories that are the toughest. And the way it works, there are 5 columns on a blackboard in our newsroom, and they're Wallace, Safer, Reasoner, Bradley, and Sawyer. And the idea is to have enough stories always up on that board so that I have the luxury of looking up there once a week and saying, okay, that Wallace story, that Bradley story. I said, wait a minute, those are both, that's too long. That Wallace, that Sawyer, no, they're too much alike. Wait a minute, Bradley, Sawyer, and that Safer story will work as a show. So you always have enough, it's like moving pieces on a chessboard, and you always want to have enough stories in the bank to move around. Now, as far as a news peg.
That's Tuesday morning.
Yeah,
Thursday morning, it's all changed.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, we very, very seldom work on what are called news pegs. We have a wonderful luxury at 60 Minutes. Makes it a lot easier for us. The news peg for a 60-minute story is usually the fact that we did it. Morley Safer many years ago did a story on a marvelous school teacher in Chicago named Marva Collins, who was teaching kids in the ghetto Chaucer and Shakespeare and God knows what else. And the next Monday morning, half America was talking about Marva Collins. There was no news peg. We just did it. In most other cases, the news peg would have been she just got named Teacher of the Year. But we never wait for news pegs like that. It's a wonderful luxury for us to know that people in America talk about Exocet missiles and Ronald Reagan and Yvonne Lendl and what was on 60 Minutes last Sunday. So just the fact that you did it, it becomes sort of a news thing. It's a wonderful luxury. It's something I never had when I worked in other broadcasts.
How many stories do you usually have up on that board at a given time?
Well, the ideal is to have about 5 stories per correspondent. And to coin a phrase, I should live so long.
Take a question from Anchorage, KTVA. Go ahead with your question.
60 Minutes would make a great case study for a communications law class. I would like to know whether the legal problems the show has encountered have influenced the editorial concept and choice of stories, and what changes have occurred to avoid such problems.
We've been sued, you say 37 times.
37 times.
I thought it was more than that. We have lost none. So, now, having said that, I think that over the years, because from time to time we've been sued, the lawyers conceivably are called in to make sure that we're not going to be sued, or the chances are that we're not going to be sued. And I think we pay probably somewhat more attention to it today than we used to pay, let's say, 10, 12 years ago.
San Francisco, KPIX. Question, please. San Francisco? All right.
Yeah. Would you describe 60 Minutes primarily as journalism or primarily as drama, and what is the mix of each, please?
That's a standard question. We always get that. But usually it's not drama, it's entertainment. Sure, I hope it's entertaining. If I edited a newspaper, I would hope it would be entertaining. If I edited Time or Newsweek, I hope it would be entertaining. There's a fine line between, I think, news and reality. News is usually defined as what happened in the last 24 hours. and that's what the CBS Evening News and Rather and Brokaw and Jennings deal with. We sort of deal with the news of the times in which we live, and we try to make it entertaining. If we didn't, we wouldn't be here.
Most people watched Fawn Hall, and as they watched Fawn Hall, weren't thinking what good, assiduous Americans they were because they were paying attention to the news. They were being wonderfully entertained by the country's leading shredder of the week.
But it wasn't just Fawn Hall, Morley.
No, but
the whole thing was a great
entertaining.
drama that went on between the senators and Secord and Jack Singlaub and Elliot Abrams. It was like watching a great courtroom drama.
Look, when Diane did Hyman Rickover, that is news. She and Ed Murrow are the only two people that I know of that got him to go on the air. So it's news, but as we saw tonight, it was entertainment simultaneously.
I think the question is really, when do the two values conflict, and do you make your choice against the facts for entertainment? I don't think we've ever had to make a choice against the facts or wanted to.
I think that's where they separate the men from the boys or the girls from the women, when you know how to make things entertaining without compromising good journalism.
Question from Lakeland, Florida, Merrill Lynch office.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Our question relates to the cost of producing the stories. Is there a budget, and what's the most you've ever spent on one of the stories?
Well, that's not a Merrill Lynch question I ever heard. Each story cost the neighborhood about $70,000. We do 3 stories. The broadcasts usually come in somewhere between $400,000 and $500,000 a broadcast. However, when business is good, 60 Minutes gets $400,000 a minute for its commercials, and there are 6.5 minutes of commercials, so you don't need a computer to tell you if it costs you somewhere between $4 and $5 to do it, and you bill somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.6, that it's a very profitable venture.
My section costs about $1.98, so you have to factor that in.
If these 3 pieces cost $70,000 a piece, that comes to $210,000.
Right.
And the show costs between $400,000 and $500,000.
Right.
Now I know where your salary
and yours. And everybody else's. And the charge...
Oh, the $70,000 does not include Saber's salary.
It includes the rent and the lights and the studio and all the overhead. And the Chinese bookkeeping that nobody's ever figured out.
Bill McClure spent $70,000 just on the research.
Bill McClure spends that on his car.
Question from WAGA in Atlanta. Your question, please.
What are your criteria for fairness? This seems to be based on a perception that you've been criticized for being biased.
Well, I'll come back to that fail-safe. Let's say that I set out, or any one of us sets out to be unfair. Or let's say that in the course of doing a piece, unfairness creeps in. In order for that to get on the air that way, we're not working to a deadline. On the Rather News each night, or Brokaw or Jennings, they're working to a deadline, and they got to do it in a hurry. We're not. We have lots of time to put these things together. And as I said, there's a producer and a correspondent who are responsible for that rough cut. And that goes to Scheffler and Hewitt, who look at it for that very thing, among others, fairness, accuracy, fairness. There's also a woman by the name of Esther Cartagena who goes through every interview that is done in the course of doing a piece to make sure that the questions and the answers are, that the answers follow the questions, number one, and that they are fair in what is chosen out of each interview. Then it goes to the vice president in charge of 60 Minutes at CBS, and occasionally, if necessary, to the lawyer. So the chances are that if there is the possibility of its being unfair, that whole crowd is going to have to conspire to make it unfair.
There's
and
another,
they don't do it.
factor, you know. I think if there was some kind of institutional unfairness in this broadcast, we would not be celebrating our 3rd year on the air, because I think people know that you can smell something wrong with the kind of broadcast that practices consciously or through habit unfairness within those pieces.
Don and I were talking the other day about that perversely illuminating poll that someone did, and I can't remember the source of it right now, when they decided to take the companies that had been in the recent time period, in their words, savaged on 60 Minutes to see what happened to them after they had been on 60 Minutes. They found, to their astonishment, that after this allegedly brutal treatment by 60 Minutes, on the average, the stock went up 12% the morning after the broadcast, which may tell you something about name dissemination, but which may also tell you something about the fact that they get their points across.
But I think the American public does not understand how fair in general television news has been, nor how lucky the American public has been to have television news operating on the high journalistic standards it always has. And this is not only 60 Minutes, but television news at the 3 networks has operated as fairly as it knows how. And I think most journalists that I know are more honest than any other businessman I know, because it's a strange thing, but honesty is almost a hobby with journalists. It's what they talk about at lunch. It's something that honesty amuses them. It amuses them to be honest. And I think the American public is under a false impression that that's not true, as that question suggests.
Question from the University of Utah in Logan, Utah. Question, please.
How many times have you been caught with egg on your face? Things like errors of fact, bad judgment and coverage of a story, things of that sort.
Got the wrong capital of Switzerland twice, I think.
No, once we said that Geneva was the capital of Switzerland. That was the best correction we ever did. Harry said the capital of Mike said last week, Harry said the capital of Switzerland was Geneva, and he said, Harry, you want to try that again? And then we had Harry do it again. He said, the capital of Switzerland is Bern, and Mike said, good boy, Harry. No, we have corrected. There's only one major one I remember we had to correct, and we should have corrected. We did a story in Illinois Power, and we used someone in our piece who had been fired by Illinois Power, and we didn't say it at the time, and we made sure we said it the following week, because it was something that should have been said, that that person had been fired by that company.
One correction we didn't make was a specific request from Imelda Marcos. You saw that interview? Afterwards, she called us to tell us that she thought, first of all, that it was the cruelest thing that had ever been done to her. But second of all, to complain because we had obviously sent out cameramen who would make her look fat. We were powerless to correct, I'm afraid.
I got an interesting piece of mail this week, as a matter of fact, about correction. I wonder what the reaction is of you people. A lawyer by the name of Charles Rembar watched our story, our update, rather, on Ray Donovan, the former Secretary of Labor, who was found not guilty. We said was found innocent. Charles Rembar, the attorney, said, no, he was not found innocent. He was found not guilty. In the British system, it would maybe be not proven. And the fact of the matter is that there is a difference between not guilty and found innocent. And he's asked for a correction.
He should live so long.
Ray Donovan has
Ray Donovan would like one, too. No, Ray Donovan liked it better with innocent.
I'm sure he did.
We have a question from Melbourne, Florida, Merrill Lynch office. The question?
Hello?
Go ahead.
Hello?
Go ahead, you're on.
Yeah, I have a question for Morley Safer. And before the question, I just wanted to give him my personal compliments for the story well done on Lionel Jeter. Now, question A, do you hear from Mr. Jeter at all? Question B, where is he currently employed?
Yes, we do hear from Lionel Jeter. We were, all of us, invited to the wedding. He got married within a couple of weeks of having been released to the young woman who stood by him through his terrible ordeal. They now have a baby, and we were invited to the christening of that. He is still working at E-Systems. He's been promoted twice. There was a lot of talk at the time, and a lot of his friends suggested that he leave the company and move elsewhere. There was too much bad blood in Texas over this and everything else. And he decided to stick it out, and he's doing very well.
Question from Des Moines KCCI. Go ahead. Des Moines. All right, from Pittsburgh WQED. Go ahead with your question, please. Is Pittsburgh there? Well, then let's go to Fort Myers to WINK. Go ahead.
Hi, this is for Diane Sawyer. Just wanted to ask her, being the first and only female in the 60 Minutes program, what kind of pressures did you or do you feel, and does everyone expect more from you because you are a female?
Do you expect more from me? Because I'm a female?
Question was to you.
Well, I would just repeat myself, which I said once on another broadcast. That, you know, the real problem with being the only woman on this broadcast is that you give Morley a little pinch on the bottom and he thinks you don't take him seriously anymore. You know, journalism institutionalizes you. We're all out after the facts, we're all out after the story. You do it in more or less the same way, bringing to it everything you are, whether it's being female, whether it's being short, whether it's being tall, whether it's having one kind of experience or the other. So that I really don't think at the end of the day you can ever say there's a gender distinction that you can make in what you've done. Initially, probably in the beginning, when all of the stories were coming out, I was alert for signs of it, and the only one I could find, as I've said once before, was that sometimes they would finish the sentences in the men's room, and I would still be standing out the door after an animated conversation down the hall. Other than that, I just don't think there's a useful distinction to be made about it.
You know, there's something interesting that's happened, I guess, possibly, obviously the time, but television never went through the kind of the sob sister kind of reporter that newspapers still, there's women's page stories.
Well, they had
still a newspaper. Generally speaking, even on local news, there's a mix of stories that are covered by a mix of reporters, don't you think?
Yeah, they had the women's programs in the afternoon, which
I'm
were
talking about the newsrooms,
But in the newsroom itself, I think you're right. I think from the very beginning, I was the first woman on television in Louisville, Kentucky, doing news, and I covered the fires and the murders and the late night beat. And I mainly remember that that was the era of the mini skirt, and it was pretty tough to shinny up some of those ladders sometimes to get the story.
You're going to cover more fires in this broadcast.
Didn't you find that there was more pressure just from not being a woman, but being the new person on the block?
Always.
That was put on you?
You know, the mini skirt's coming back. Maybe you could get her on a fire this year.
I'm thinking. When I first joined this broadcast, we were taking new publicity pictures. And I was standing in front of Mike, and he, just as the photographer said, "Give me one more smile," he leaned over and he said, "You know, if this show goes in the dumper, they'll blame you."
I have a question from Flint, Michigan, WFUM. Go ahead with your question. Flint, Michigan?
That's marvelous, isn't it, this technological?
You know, this is typical of television. The audio never works. The pictures are always fine.
Let's try Bakersfield, K-E-R-O. Bakersfield?
How about the audio?
Maybe they
Let's
don't
go
know
to
where
New
they
York.
are.
Have a question? Go ahead.
With all the budget cuts in the new administration, how do you feel that's going to affect the quality of 60 Minutes and the quality of CBS News, the tradition of being the best since Edward R. Murrow?
Andy is an authority on this.
Adversely.
Oh, Lord.
Well, I mean, if you cut staff members and you have fewer people covering the news, you're going to get less news. I don't think there's any question about it. You deny that?
Let me tell you a stunning fact. Everybody talks about the $30 million cut at CBS. Nobody talks about the $270 million they didn't cut. $270 million, which is the budget of CBS News now, is 3 times the budget of the New York Times and 5 times the budget of the Washington Post. And they cover 10 times more news than we do. Well, admittedly, it's more expensive to do what we do. I mean, we got to do things like have the audio fail from Bakersfield. You got to pay for that.
Do you think CBS has as many competent people working for it now as it did 2 years ago?
I think that at any time that firing is always a sad thing. I think it's terrible when people get fired anywhere. I'm not sure that making places more efficient is necessarily a bad thing.
I think there was a very difficult to measure consequence, an adverse one, and that is the money, the people, the publicity that it received. There's no question got right to the heart of an awful lot of people working in our various newsrooms. I think to that extent, the morale of CBS was and still is very seriously affected by all of that. I think the fact that people could suddenly be fired, which never really happened in that kind of scale or with that kind of publicity before, made people uneasy, made people look over their shoulder, made people, I don't know, take a lower profile even. And I think there is a very serious effect, and you can't measure that. It's hard to measure that. You can't, and you don't know how to bounce back from something like that. I think there's no question that I don't know if I agree with Andy that necessarily that we're less capable of doing a good job. I think we still are. But I think psychologically we are perhaps less capable of doing the job we once could do.
And the real answer probably is a year down the way. We're going to find out, really, over a period of months and maybe a couple of years, if that diminution of staff really does make that much difference.
But there's no question about the matter of morale. It's an interesting thing. I realized during the recent unpleasantness that I and a good many other people had felt this great loyalty to CBS, or thought we had. And the fact of the matter is that I think all of us admire ourselves for being loyal. And we like the quality of loyalty in ourselves, no matter what it is we are being loyal to. And I think a lot of us have found out that we have been loyal for years to a sort of a non-existent entity. And I think that's what has happened to morale at CBS.
Let's take a call. South Bend WSBD. Go ahead with your question.
Yes, WSBT in South Bend, thank you. My question is, why do you still use film in your broadcast instead of videotape?
Well, it's about half and half now. We resisted tape for a lot of years, not because we didn't think tape was a better picture than film. The audio on tape is inferior. And I happen to believe that now it's gotten good, and we're now going over to tape because the audio is getting better. I happen to believe that it is your ear as much as your eye that keeps you at that television set. And you can put up a marginal picture, and as long as the audio is good, they'll watch it. The reverse, they will not. You can put up the most beautiful picture in the world, and if the audio is difficult to listen to, the audience is gone. They don't stay there. So we were more interested in audio than in pictures, and until recently, you could not get the audio quality out of tape that you got out of film.
Let's try Bakersfield again, KERO. Go ahead with your question.
Good evening from California. New York had Love Canal. Missouri had Times Beach. How does the AIDS epidemic fit into the U.S.'s problem and the problem as a major U.S. health threat?
I have an opinion. Do I get to have it? I think the interesting thing about the AIDS epidemic, and I am somewhat nervous about the fact that we have focused so much attention away from things like cancer, because the AIDS people, it is still primarily a disease, with minor number of exceptions, acquired by homosexuals and drug needle users. And they are a constituency. They get together, they organize, which cancer, people who get the disease cancer do not. And there is an interesting thing that's happened about AIDS. They have managed to make it something that the question whether they should be ashamed of having AIDS or not comes up with AIDS victims. Most of them are obviously somewhat ashamed of it because you can see by the obituaries in the paper, it is not usually noticed that the person died of AIDS, even though it's well known that he did. And the question of whether a person should be ashamed of it or not is an interesting big question, because if nobody is ashamed of it, it's going to proliferate. In other words, the more shame attached to it, the more people are going to avoid getting it. This is tangential to the question, but I think there are some very interesting questions about the AIDS, the government's emphasis, and medicine, science's emphasis on AIDS, as opposed to the persistent problem of cancer and a good many other things that do not have the same...
I think there's real questionable logic. I mean, the more they're ashamed of it, the less people are going to... Good heavens, there was an epidemic of gonorrhea in this country, and still is.
Yes, and it was
and
shameful
no one's
to have
particularly
it.
proud of it, even today. In fact, they may be more willing to say they have AIDS than some of these other sexually transmitted diseases. I think shame is going to make the disease go
I think
away.
it already has made a big difference morally.
If I could take the question and just turn it around, what would be a 60 Minutes angle on the AIDS story? What would...
Talk to the lady on your left. You just came back from Africa.
Just came back from Uganda, and we went over there really to do two things. To try to get a keener understanding of the difference in heterosexual transmission in Africa, where it's one-to-one, male to female and female to male, and the difference in the way the virus is transmitted there and the way it seems to be transmitted here, which is it's still extremely difficult for a woman to give it to a man. Men give it to women more easily here. But that's part of the reason, while it's spreading in the heterosexual community, it's spreading at such a slow rate at this stage. We also went over there not to examine it through the prism of our own experience, but just to see what it's like when you go to a section of the country where 1 out of 3 people has the virus. What it's like when you go house after house after house, and somebody inside is dying of AIDS. And they are mothers. They are 48-year-old mothers. And they're their children, and their husbands, and their sisters, and their cousins, just to take a look at what they are trying to cope with there. So you'll see it in the fall.
Good. Let's take a question from Boston, WNEV. Go ahead.
Greetings from all the interns at Channel 7. I just want to know, during the history of 60 Minutes, has there ever been a news story too, quote-unquote, controversial for public broadcast?
No. Can't think of one in 19 years.
Never. Never, ever have we ever been told we can't broadcast any particular subject.
One story really tells how it does happen on 60 Minutes, and that is the fact that for a long time, the single biggest sponsor on 60 Minutes was the Ford Motor Company. And we wanted to do a story about the Ford Pinto. Now, mind you, I think they were spending, the sum was at that time, $5 million a year on 60 Minutes. They weren't anxious, obviously. I mean, they didn't tell us that, but we knew that they were not going to be anxious for us to do the story. We did the story about the Ford Pinto and the exploding gas tanks. They cooperated with us, gave us their people to talk to us. Obviously, they did not do a commercial on that particular broadcast, and we wondered if indeed they would stay with the broadcast. They not only were back the next week, they are with us, and this is years later. We have never had any commercial pressure.
Audi, same thing.
We did an Audi piece this year, a piece that showed the problems, serious problems with the Audi 5000, and the very next week Audi ran a commercial, which prompted a letter. What do we as a viewer think when we see a piece one week that says the Audi is an unsafe car, and then the next week see a commercial for the same car?
There's an interesting division, isn't it? That you people at Merrill Lynch obviously think more about these things than we do because we're just Grub Street journalists. But that the people who make the decisions about where money is spent are not going to punish themselves by withdrawing a commercial from a broadcast that very clearly sells Audis and Fords and the CJ Jeeps. We did the same sort of story on.
But advertisers in America know now that they are buying an audience and time. They're not buying the show. They're buying the time on the show.
Right. So take a question from the audience.
Who is the most interesting person that you did a profile on, and why? Some to any, or all?
That's so hard to say, really, because each one that you do, you kind of fall in love with in a strange way, or you get very angry at in a strange way. And it's really difficult to say who the most interesting profile is. Conceivably, Vladimir Horowitz for me. I fell in love with Lena Horne when you did.
So did I. You know, usually you think of the last one as the best one because it's you know, it's like the last interview. You tend to believe, I tend to believe the last person I spoke to.
Well, but let me ask you this. Who was the one that you did who turned out to be the most different from what you thought going in?
Cesar Chavez.
Yeah, conceivably, it wasn't a profile, but you're right. The Coors Brewing Company. We'd gotten a lot of mail about, and forgive me, we'd gotten some mail, but we had gotten a lot of talk from the AFL-CIO about the hiring practices, minorities and so forth, and homosexuals at the Coors Brewing Company, and we were going to do the piece whether they helped us or not, and we told them that. And we really expected to see a bunch of mouth-breathing conservative Neanderthals out there. What happened was that the Coors Brewing Company were intelligent enough to open up their operation to us. We could talk to anybody in the organization that we wanted. They opened their books, I'm sure with I don't know how much they opened their books, but in fact, they really gave us every opportunity to find that if indeed those practices had gone on, it had stopped 10 or 15 years ahead of time, and that probably was, Diane, the single most surprising piece that I have ever done, yes, and it redounded to the benefit of the Coors Brewing Company for having
I'll tell you the least interesting person I ever interviewed, the least interesting profile, a person I actively ended up disliking. And I said earlier that you get passionate and fired up about these stories. I confess to one in which I did not get fired up. I got talked into doing a profile of a man by the name of Jean-Pierre Rampal, great flautist, whatever the right way to say it, who turned out to be the most tepid yet self-aggrandizing man I have ever had the misfortune to spend more than an hour with, and I was misfortunate enough to spend much more than an hour with him. And I kept asking myself, as this story deteriorated more and more, at least in my head, why am I cannot wait to get out of the presence of this creep. We be sued for that? I don't
Yes,
and it was
probably.
just the most.
38 suits.
I'm sure he's a brilliant musician to all of you flout lovers.
Last night we were at a party, and afterwards I noticed that a lot of us who were in the business stayed around and talked after everyone had left. And I couldn't think, in relation to your problem, your question, the most interesting people you've ever met and talked to. Great journalist named Hal Boyle. Somebody would ask Hal Boyle, they'd say, you must meet an awful lot of interesting people in your business. And Hal said, yeah, and most of them are other journalists.
Do you know the most interesting person you did who I was the most surprised by? Mrs. Aquino. She was a very different person from what I was led to believe. I was led to believe that she was going to be kind of dull, and she was so frank. It was unbelievable.
So
she surprised
frank.
me.
Yes, and you realize that the steel inside her comes from a very different source than political steel usually comes from.
right.
It comes from having been a woman who went to see her husband in jail for conjugal visits, knowing that members who are now members of her government, were then members of the Marcos administration, were spying on them. This comes from a woman who earned her stripes in a very different fashion.
Take a question from Rochester, WHEC. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm wondering, going back to the conversation a few minutes ago about job cuts at CBS News, Since this is one of the major stories of corporate America and one of the major stories of American journalism, and a story right under your noses, why did 60 Minutes not do the story of those job cuts and the effect on American journalism?
Well, first of all, I don't know what the effect on American journalism is, and maybe if we see there's an effect on American journalism, we'll do it. There's only one other thing I'd like to say. NBC and ABC cut out just as many jobs as we did. And again, I go back to the fact that maybe somebody ought to look at the number of people we do hire, and the fact that I think it would probably stun all of you if I told you how many people CBS had covering Reykjavik. Do you know there were 100 CBS people at Reykjavik? There were 100 NBC people and 100 ABC people. And somebody took a look at all that and said, this is ridiculous. So I don't think there's any great, terrible thing going to happen if maybe next time there's a Reykjavik, if we only
well,
send
there's an
50.
interesting point. The one reason we didn't do it because everybody else did.
That's right.
Which is always a reason for us not to do a story, but not necessarily. The other thing is, supposing in his infinite wisdom, Wallace went out to do that story, came back and said to Don, I got to tell you, there's not going to be any effect of this job. We're going to go with this story? Is anyone going to think that might be a little self-serving to the new management of CBS? Supposing, what would you say? What would you say if Mike came in with a damn good piece and was able, if one could, to prove that the effect indeed will not be a bad one, and we might be a better, leaner, meaner
would you
news
run
division.
it?
Would you run it?
No, I think there's a better question. I think that
No, answer the question.
Wait a minute, I
Tell
don't
me
think
the
it would have
question.
sent him in the first place, because I'm smart enough to know he may come back with
He
that.
convinced you. He
No,
convinced
I've got to know that always, when you go out to do a story, if you're honest reporters, as all of you are, there are two sides of the coin. And you got to say, suppose you come back and say, wait a minute, this is a good thing for all of us. It's going to look like we've been put up to this by CBS management. I think we would avoid it.
Look, Don, I don't know whether you're hiding it or you've forgotten it. I know damn well you considered doing this story. No,
we did. We considered doing Larry Tisch as the new boy on the block in broadcasting. What was he doing? And decided that it was one of those things that if he acquitted himself very well, we were there doing a Valentine to our own boss, and we didn't want to be in the position doing
to
it.
expect the New York Times to investigate the New York Times. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
right.
one step.
The fact
You can't do
remains
it.
that the man in Rochester asked a perfectly good question. It is the kind of story that we can indeed do it, but again, I think it's a year away yet. We don't know what the effect is yet. It was being covered, as you said, Morley, every night on all of the evening newses and in the newspapers. Give it a year. Let's see what really happens, and I think it makes a perfectly sensible story.
Can we
to tell.
ever ask a question back to the gentleman just asked that? Which one of the evening news broadcasts do you watch? Rather, Brokaw, or Jennings?
Is he still on the line?
If you're still on the line.
Raise your hand.
He's not on the line, because I want to say to him, has he noticed any difference since the cuts? Because they were the same at all three networks. Rochester's gone.
They go to bed early there.
Well, let's go to Pullman, Washington, in another time zone. Your question,
yes,
please?
wondering how 60 Minutes has changed since its first year, and if so, why?
One change, Safer and I were talking about it the other day. One change is that the stories, which used to be interminable. I mean, you'd do a 21-minute story and say, that's really not enough time to go to the story. You look at it today and you know darn well it isn't worth 9 minutes.
It's fascinating when we listen to stories from, say, 16, 17 years ago. It's as if we're suffering from some kind of speech defect of speaking very slowly.
A lot of time to fill.
Well,
Very few
it was also we
commercials.
had to explain things so carefully to Dawn.
I think you're better looking than you were then, too, Mike.
Let's go to Las Vegas to KLAS.
Yes. What was the real reason, or the reason you didn't air the Senator Paul Laxalt story that Mike Wallace worked on?
I knew it was coming.
I tell you why. We had one very good source, one out there. And the man, you don't like to go with a story about a senator, give it, be it Laxalt or anybody else. You don't want to go with a tough story on the basis of one source. especially when you find that that one source is lying to you about some other things, and that's what we found. And Hewitt and I talked about it and agonized about it. We had a finished piece and said, you cannot go with a man whom you know to be a liar. We had another one very recently in which the same thing happened. A hell of a story. And then we found out that the man, probably 70% of what he was telling us probably was the truth, but 30% was not the truth. Under those circumstances, do you want to go with the story based on what a man has told you if you know the man to be telling untruths?
Let's go to Delray Beach, Merrill Lynch office.
Thank you. We have a question for Andy Rooney. Andy, how do you choose your story subjects? Are they all your own ideas, or do you have a staff that helps you out?
No, they're all my own ideas. They don't. It really doesn't seem like much of an idea. I mean, is a can of soup really an idea? I don't. I have said this before. One of the questions that irritates me the most is, do you write all your own material? My God, I am a writer. That's all I am, and I happen to do my own stuff on the air, but I think of myself as a writer. I use very few ideas that come into me. I can think of a couple. I got a great letter, and I've kept it for years. And this fellow wrote me, and I wish I knew how to do this. He said, look at the dictionaries and check the words that they choose to illustrate in dictionaries. Well, it's a fascinating idea. They'll have an owl, and you look at 3 dictionaries, and they'll all illustrate the owl. I don't know how they decide, but I can't do it. So often it's impractical, and an awful lot of people. I get maybe 30 letters a month suggesting I do how hard envelopes are to open, or I don't know, something like that I've either done or. So I don't take many ideas from outside, and the idea usually doesn't make that much difference. I have found that people have an exaggerated notion of the importance of an idea. There are so many good ideas in the world that we already have, and so few people who know how to do anything about one, that it is usually the execution that's more important than any single idea.
May I ask a question? You have a favorite piece that you've done?
No, I don't.
No? I do.
Of mine or yours?
Oh, yours. the piece that you did with where they make the little containers of supposed to be milk, and you went down to it's some kind of farms it's called, and it's down here on 9th Avenue someplace.
That. Well, you know,
you have grass back in that building.
And you see, you go to a supermarket, and they have these bottles of milk and everything, and Sunnydale Farms, and it's made down here on 9th Avenue in New York. And I went and asked where the farm was. You know.
He once went to the Mrs. Wagner's pie factory looking for Mrs. Wagner.
Mrs. Smith.
Question from the audience.
Yeah, how about, lots of the programs that you've done over the years have certainly righted some injustices. How about some examples of some of those that may have been the most satisfying to see the results after maybe a period of time and seeing what had happened and occurred after the story had played?
Well, the number one is Linnell Jeter. We all getting someone out of jail who was serving a life sentence. And Morley doesn't want to say this because he's a little too modest, but Morley and Suzanne St. Pierre, his producer, went down there and did all the legwork that Linnell Jeter's own attorneys should have done, and came up with stuff that they had never even began to look into.
That story was interesting, and we kept finding. I must say that going into that story, none of us were convinced that the guy was innocent. What we did feel that a $25 holdup maybe didn't deserve a life sentence. But we were absolutely open about whether the guy was guilty or innocent. There seemed to be enough questions to be asked. And doing that story took us longer than any story I can think of that I worked on. It was almost 6 months because we kept going back and back and back and finding new stuff. And occasionally stuff that questioned our own beliefs as we started to believe he might be innocent. And what made that particularly satisfying is that Suzanne St. Pierre and Marty Galovic, who was a researcher on that, and to some extent myself, each of us came up on his own with a different, new piece of evidence. So it was since working on this broadcast is the most collaborative kind of journalism, to have all those things fall into each of our laps was just a great thrill.
But this is where the cutback in staff is going to hurt the most. I know these people pretty well, and the greatest satisfaction they get is in reporting. It is just exhilarating to get on the phone and get facts and check one against the other and find out who's lying. It's just one of the thrills of, I mean, look at Mike. He just loves hearing about it. I mean, he loves it. And reporting is so expensive because it takes so much time. I mean, Mike he could spend 6 weeks on one story doing a good job on it. Satisfying to him, but they can't afford to let him do it. You see local reporters, they got to go out and do 3 stories a day. The assignment editor says, go down and stand in front of City Hall. Here's the story. They don't want to do any reporting. Doesn't have any time to do any reporting. And they don't have any staff to do it for him. That's where television news is going to hurt. There's going to be a cut in the amount of serious reporting. A lot of storytelling, but less reporting. Probably even on 60 Minutes.
Matter of fact, Don, face it, on 60 Minutes, with the cutback in researchers, associate producers, he's right. He's right.
No, he's not right.
Yes, he's right.
There are producers around 60 Minutes who complain there aren't enough researchers finding jobs for them, and I say, why don't you
Finding stories
for them?
Go down
Find
to the
your
library.
own stories.
Go
You're the
down to
highest paid bunch of journalists in the world.
Not a question of
Come
finding.
on, they've
Go
all
down.
gotten fat, rich, and happy
It's getting
and lazy.
nasty now. This is the good part.
Seriously.
I hate to acknowledge it, but he
I hate
happens to be
acknowledge
right
it
about
too,
this
but
one
When was
one
the last
thing.
time you went down to what used to be one of the best news libraries in New York? What used to be, and go down there. It's a haunted house down there. There's nobody there.
That's the one place the cutbacks have hurt.
Well, what more important?
But there is a point. I mean,
what we do.
cutback. So they cut back from 300 million to 270 million. Suppose they cut back from 6 billion to 400 million. I mean, whatever. Part of the problem with news guys is that
Don,
they think they weren't hired. They
how
think
much
they were
profit-
ordained.
how much profit
You
does
all
60
guys think
Minutes-
it's the priest. Look, you're
Good
throwing water.
Lord.
No, but it seems to
They-
me. But it
Now
seems
you know
wait
why
a
we
minute.
don't have meetings.
It seems to me that it's possible that you're arguing the same thing, in that you think things should be cut back, but not necessarily the ones that were.
Right.
And
Stop
it's
trying
a
to
question
make
of
peace.
what should be
You're
cut back.
absolutely right.
You think 100 people at Reykjavik should be cut back, and that's where the money should be saved, but not the
Exactly.
researcher
Not the
who goes
researcher.
out
You're
and looks
absolutely
for
right.
the
I
story.
think they did it in a silly way, but it's axiomatic. We've known this. And if you have 100 guys in your Washington bureau and you cut 2 down to 98, they say we can't cover Washington with 98 guys. If you had 6 in the Washington bureau and you cut it to 4, they say we can't cover Washington with 4 people. There's a resistance to any kind of cutback anywhere, anytime, any place.
The question was just about 60 Minutes.
How many people went to Venice? Do you know?
No, they cut back on Venice. ABC and NBC each had twice as many people in Venice where absolutely nothing happened. I mean, you could have phoned that
Twice
in.
as many as we had?
Yeah. Well, they anchored out of there, and Jennings was there, and Brokaw was there, and what they were doing there, I still don't know, except maybe getting their feet wet or riding in gondolas, because nothing happened there.
Let's go to San Francisco, KPIX. Question, please.
I have a comment and then a question. All of us here in San Francisco were highly offended by Don's comment about Chinese bookkeepers. This evening's earlier comments about minorities and women really are making our eyes roll and our jaws drop to the floor, and maybe 60 Minutes can do a program to investigate the aspirations of minorities and women in America. Now to my question. Several weeks ago, 60 Minutes featured Ning Chin, the author of Life and Death in Shanghai. And the question is, to what degree do your journalistic standards of 60 Minutes get compromised when that particular feature crossed the line of almost promoting the book, sort of like their own PR agent?
That's an interesting question, and one we are all extremely sensitive to, and why you see that kind of story on 60 Minutes so rarely, perhaps once a year, maybe once every 2 years. But every once in a while, a book comes along that is beyond another book about China or the economy or the CIA or whatever, and is, in a sense, a seminal work. I think Nien Ching's book is. It was the most revealing and articulate description of the Cultural Revolution that I've read, and I've read, whether you believe it or not, most of it. And it was also beautifully written. That is an event. That's a news story. Whether she sells 100 more or 1,000 more books or not. We're certainly not there to promote the book. We are there to promote a wonderful woman with an extraordinary talent who went through a period of hell in her life. And I plead guilty to promoting a book, I guess.
But I want to take his bait for a minute. Can he still hear us?
Sure.
I mean, I would like to know, as I guess I will assume here the mantleship of custodian of insults to women here. I'd like to know what you think we have said that has been so offensive to women.
He's not on the line anymore?
He can't reply.
Can't reply?
Maybe we can get him back on.
Well, if you can still hear me, I apologize if that remark was offensive, and I will not use that phrase anymore, and I thank you for pointing it out that it probably could be an offensive
Wasn't
phrase.
that interesting? You've used that a lot and never occurred to
dawned
nothing.
on me, and it does dawn on me now.
Yeah.
And I will watch it in the future. Thank you.
The Korean bookkeeping you'll start.
There you go. It's going to be another thing from Lexington.
Kentucky, KYT. Go ahead.
Yes, we'd like to know if you feel the success of 60 Minutes has led to a growth in local television investigative reporting, and if so, what do you think of that trend?
Myself, I'm all for it if it's well done, and a lot of it is very well done. A lot of it is self-conscious and more self-consciously dramatic than substantial, but a great deal of it is good, serious, local investigative reporting. And if we've helped spawn it, so much the better.
Houston, KHOU. Go ahead, please.
We'd like your collective thoughts on why 60 Minutes works so well in comparison to other news shows such as Our World, West 57th, and various other attempts. What is that magic formula?
No one knows what it is.
I don't think any of us know. I mean, I'm convinced that it's 5 reasons. It's Mike and Morley and Harry and Diane and Ed, because I just think the American public sort of is having a love affair with these 5 people every Sunday at 7 o'clock, and I don't know.
Chubby.
No, we cut him most of the time. and the chemistry between all these people and Mike's friend Chubby, Andy, I don't think the stories we find are any better than the stories the rest of them find. I just think these people tell them better. I used to wonder how NBC could go to the well that many times and not bring back water on all the magazines they did. And then I realized I watched their stories. They were the same kind of stories we might do, but I just don't think they told them as well as the people on 60 Minutes tell them.
Fact is also, though, that Our World is up against the Cosby Show, and we are up against competition that's not at all.
Our World is
that
excellent. Our World is Sunday morning with Charles Kuralt, Nightline with Koppel, This Week with David Brinkley are class operations. There are no shows better.
And some CBS executives in the past stuck with this show for 8 years when it was not number 1, 2, 3, or 5, 2. And it's quite possible that some of the other shows, 2020, they have stuck with 2020, which is a successful and good show. I think the fact that this has a momentum of its own now, people like continuity in their lives, they like familiarity, and they're familiar with all these people.
And I think Sunday's a different kind of day of the week than a Tuesday night or a Thursday night or a Friday night. And habits are different. And I think there are more people who are inclined to watch this broadcast on a Sunday night at that hour.
Let's take a question from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, WUNC.
Hi. I was wondering what unusual non-media careers that any of you have led before becoming journalists that may or may not have contributed to your journalism skills.
I was a school teacher. I taught school for 3.5 years in Philadelphia. I taught elementary school. And if there's one skill that traveled with me as a school teacher, it's being able to tell stories. Because what you do in a classroom with kids is give them a daily lesson in the form of a story. Whatever that story is today, to keep the kids' attention, you have to be a good storyteller. And I think that's what we do best at 60 Minutes, is to tell stories. And it's in a lot of ways easier to do it on television than to do it with a class of 38 kids in the 6th grade.
32 years ago, I played the juvenile lead in a Broadway show.
How many years?
32 years, 1955, called Reclining Figure. And, you know, I say that because the performance aspect of what we do is part of the effectiveness of what we do. And the fact of having that opportunity and doing that work, I am sure, helped me to understand how to project whatever it is I try to project.
Diane, did your time in government help?
Is that a euphemism?
Time in government, yeah.
I worked 8 years for Richard Nixon in the White House for 4 years, and then I worked on his memoirs for 4 years, helped with the writing of his memoirs. The time helped. You never know how much of it's growing up, how much of it's just getting bruised a bit generally, how much you just think you've got wiser and maybe you just got older. But what probably did help practically was that in the writing of the book, we had to conduct a kind of seminar day in, day out on a number of issues, and it was for him a forced march. He certainly didn't want to sit there and go through it again from the first squall at the time of birth through the resignation, and my section was the last section, the resignation. And in the process of that forced march, sitting with him sometimes 6 and 7 hours a day, it was an incredible education, not just in what he had seen, in what he thought he had seen, in what he thought had happened to him, and what we objectively thought had happened to him. So that it was a fascinating 4 years. I'm not sure exactly what you do with it.
You did well with it.
Question from Atlanta, WAGA.
I'll read this as it was sent to me. Do any of you condone the style of investigative reporting that was used on Gary Hart?
Yes.
I, for one, do.
Absolutely. I do.
I don't.
You don't? Why not?
I don't. I don't because I don't think, first of all, the style, as we know, was flawed. They didn't do it thoroughly enough. We may learn tonight that they nevertheless came up with the same answer. But it wasn't done correctly. Second of all, I just don't think that that's the way you reveal character. That's the way to reveal character. I think there are other ways.
He revealed the character.
He revealed the character. I don't think.
By the questions.
You and I have argued this before, but I have argued the same way
They
that
didn't.
when the Canuck letter came out, remember the famous Canuck letter? William Loeb, the Manchester Union leader up in New Hampshire, Manchester, had a phony letter, which turned out to be a dirty trick from the Nixon administration.
Ken Clausen.
And it caused Muskie to cry. And everyone said, well, that revealed something very important. The reporters who had covered that campaign said that revealed something really important about it.
In crying, he responded to a lie, as we found out.
Right.
In the case of Gary Hart, he responded to the truth with another lie. And that was the character revealing part in that case.
Yes, but does the end justify the means?
I don't think it's a question of ends or means.
No,
if
it was
Miami
a
Herald,
lie.
I don't know how the
had a
Miami Herald
precipitate cause.
got tipped to go and stake out Gary Hart's house. Obviously they did. Somewhere along the line. What do? You don't stake out Gary Hart's house?
Particularly at a
I
time
wouldn't.
when he had just told the New York Times, follow me,
Yeah,
surveil me.
he said it.
There's no reason why you shouldn't. You'll find it dull, I think is what he said.
He challenged them to trail
Well,
him.
their story arguably was in progress, as we know, before that happened. Look, I
That's
can
right.
tell you 3 cases where I would say you would do it. You would absolutely do it. You would do it if it were national security, right? You'd do it if it were Judith Exner. You would do it if it was so flagrant as to indicate a sort of deliberate cruelty to a wife or something else. And then in the 3rd instance, you might do it if well, I can't remember what the 3rd instance was, but there certainly was a 3rd one. The 3rd instance, you might do it where you felt that he had previously challenged and lied to you, and that's the criterion under which the Miami...
He had guys on his campaign staff who quit over that issue. Because suppose you had a guy who had a big drinking problem, was running for president, right? And somebody said, hey, if you go down to Casey's bar tonight, you'll find him in there getting loaded.
That's different. I don't
Why is that
think,
different?
I don't think that kind of affair is a particularly interesting revelation of character. It doesn't, as somebody said, I mean, if
Well,
that's...
you really go with a fast crowd, don't you?
I may not approve of it, but I got to tell you, I think that everybody who says that it's justified because it revealed character is just wrong.
Why did he quit?
It doesn't...
If it was all so insignificant.
Getting
and
caught
so what?
because
And he got
of the
caught,
way
so
he
why didn't
handled...
he say, hey, that's got... Why
It
didn't he take
wasn't-
your position? It's got nothing to do with whether I'm qualified
You
for
are,
president.
but you're talking about the net effect, which was getting caught caused him to lie, which caused him, therefore, to have to quit. I'm saying that I don't think you can, however much that end is an interesting study of character, I don't think the means of investigating someone's extramarital behavior justifies it.
Would you
I
have run
really
those
don't.
pictures on the monkey business if they'd been sent you at a respectable newspaper?
Well, I don't know about those. Yeah, I might have run those pictures.
It's the end of the game.
That's different. That's different. That's not staking out
This
someone
has been
for
a
this.
What you
problem in this
object to is
guy's
hiding
life.
in the bushes or in the car outside, staking him out.
I guess I object to the idea. If we're going to do that kind of thing, know why we do it. And we do it because people were troubled by something about Gary Hart. That's really why they did it.
Troubled by
Okay.
character.
They were troubled
Right.
by something.
All right.
Troubled
You
by
just made your
character.
case. We have made our case.
But I think that
They didn't put... Nobody
the
out of a clear blue sky goes out and says to Richard Gebhard, you ever commit adultery? They don't follow Richard Gebhard around or Mike Dukakis. But Gary Hart troubled a lot of people. He troubled people on his own campaign staff who went to him and said, hey, Gary, you got to cut it out.
Stuff was
or we will...
accumulating that was more than just rumor. It wasn't enough to go with the story, but stuff was accumulating. I don't think that, and I would find it reprehensible, if the Herald or anybody went out and staked out one of these other candidates or threw these dreadful questions at them based on absolute pie in the sky nothing. Here was a man who challenged the press to follow him. The stories of philandering had been going around all the time. And then when he was finally tested on that very, very small issue, the test of character came.
I
He
think she
lied.
understands how wrong she is now.
Let's take a question from the audience here. Go ahead.
Even in the broader sense of the word, Gary Hart aside, is the competitiveness within the field of journalism today causing a blurring of that line of fairness that Andy Rooney mentioned earlier? When does investigative reporting become invasion of privacy? And are we in danger of overstepping that bounds due to the competitiveness of the industry?
Yes.
Always,
Yes.
always. The competitiveness. Again, we don't work to that kind of a deadline, but if you're working in a newspaper and you believe that the Washington Post, you're at the Miami Herald, and you think the Washington Post has that same story and about to go with it, you want to get there ahead of time. And the same thing is true of the evening newses. Occasionally they will go a little bit. I would be curious to know your reaction, though, about something else that Abe Rosenthal wrote in his column recently. We are so curious to know about the stock portfolios of politicians, where their money comes from. And he suggests that maybe we, who report, should let people know what are our sources of income, for instance, other than the work that we do on the air. If you do a lecture for some kind of a lobbying organization, the Dairy Association, what kind of stocks do you own? Do you think, how do you people feel about the fact of revealing that sort of thing?
I think it's a good idea. Voluntarily, and I don't think. I think a lot of people might not want to. I wouldn't have any problem with it. Today we were doing the I don't know. seminar today. The question came up, but were we troubled by the fact that GE now owns NBC, and GE is a prime defense contractor and may influence them? Well, how does anybody know what stocks or anything we've got that may influence what we do? I think it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask of all of us to reveal, what our interests are and how we earn our money over and above what we're paid by CBS News. I think it's a fair thing to ask of us.
I'd love to read yours.
No, I don't need nothing. It's all tax-free. You want to talk tax-free municipals?
If you tell it on this particular show, we're gonna Merrill Lynch is going to call you within a few days.
No, they call every day anyway. There's always a guy on the phone. I confess to you something about him, and it's a confession of my own as well. For years, both of us only had checking accounts. And it didn't even know that other accounts paid interest.
Having said all that, I do think
These are the people who report.
Having said that, I think it is easier for us to get caught than it is for an average politician. So I guess I'm less troubled by the fact that we don't require full disclosure, in the sense that your reporting is about facts. If your facts are wrong, it's easier for you to get caught on your mistaken facts. If your facts don't add up to a case, then it's easier. I mean, the American public is very intelligent about that. It's easier for them to conclude that based on the kind of work you do.
But suppose they had suspicions about you. Would you be willing to, if they said, hey, the reason she went after that story is because thus and so, would you say that's none of your business, or would you be prepared to defend it and disclose?
Oh, I'd be prepared to disclose. All I'm saying is I'm less troubled that we don't.
But I would be.
Because I do think it's easier for us to get caught.
Night before, good going, Ed, again. You just want to keep up with him. Night before last, I spoke in the caucus room of the Cannon Building in Washington. NYNEX paid me quite a bit of money to speak to a big group of congressmen and senators.
What do you get for a lecture now?
I'm not going to tell you what I get, but it was quite a bit. I said to Jane, Jane, I got the check today, and I said, Jane, I don't know whether I should cash that check or not. I really question whether it was right for me to have done it, and I don't know whether I'm going to cash it or not. They kept, I was so embarrassed. These idiot congressmen came up, and they had photographers with them, and they wanted their picture taken with me. Now, would I vote for a guy who wanted his picture taken with me? I mean, my God.
Did you cash the check?
No, I did not cash the check.
Gave it to Marge, did you?
No.
She'll cash it?
I don't know what to do.
You will cash
Probably
the check.
Probably I will.
Before we go too far, let's go to Bowling Green to WBGU. Go ahead with your question.
From Bowling Green State University. My question is to all of you. Do you all feel that your sources are always legitimate, whether it be UPIs, interviews, or phone calls?
What was that last word? I missed that.
Leaky-eyed interviews?
Did you say Bhopal or phone calls?
Phone calls.
Phone
or however
calls.
that you get your sources, whatever your sources are.
We'll check them.
Well, if you're in this business long enough and you're good enough, you don't fall for phony sources. And you check them out, and you want want confirmation of almost everything you're told. We hear an awful lot of stuff we don't publish,
Yeah, I think it also goes back to what Mike said on the Laxalt story, is that you had one source, and one source wasn't enough. You always, in situations like that, particularly if you know that there's some serious question of controversy there, you want to have more than one source, and you won't go with just one source. You check out people, and you check facts.
And there's never a leak been given that didn't have a motive behind it, and you ought to check the motive just as much as the leak. Why are they telling me this?
Let's go to Knoxville WBIR.
Hello?
Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Knoxville? Well, then let's go to...
Oh, you're on the air.
Then let's go
It's
to...
like the Dr. Ruth show. You're on the air.
And let's go to Colorado, KTSC.
Yes, my question is to Diane Sawyer, and I'd like to know, was there any reaction from your colleagues to your video piece you did for the Letterman Film Festival? What was the inspiration for that piece?
There's some who say there was no inspiration for that piece. There was reaction. There are those here who shall go unnamed who still think it was an abomination to have done it. I just thought it was a lark. That's
She
all.
got about the same reaction as I got from these people going on strike with honorary pickets.
Let's go to Erie, Pennsylvania, WSEE. Go ahead.
Hello. My question is for Mike Wallace, and it has to do with ambush reporting. A few years ago, it seemed 60 Minutes did a lot more interviewing whereby they would tape or film someone who didn't know they were being taped and then confront that person. Is there any reason you don't do that as much anymore? Were you ever sued for it?
We were never sued for it. We did some of it really close to the beginning of the broadcast, for the first few years of the broadcast, and then it became apparent that we were doing it, or we found that we were doing it really for more heat than light. There was a certain drama of coming upon somebody else who was unaware that you were going to ask him or her embarrassing questions. But the fact of the matter is you didn't get a lot of information that way. It was easier to phone, send a telegram, write a letter, and if you didn't get the answer, then go to his place of business and stand out in front and say, he wouldn't talk to us about this. These are the questions that we wanted to ask, and it's just as effective that way. The other thing is that we got the feeling that perhaps we were going to become a caricature of ourselves, lying in wait behind the potted palm. So we just decided not to do it, not suggesting that we will never do it. We might, but we, as you point out, we don't do it at all as often as we used to.
Let's go to South Bend, WSBT. Go ahead.
What advice do you have to a South Bend producer who would like to go to New York to work for 60 Minutes in spite of the cuts?
Send Hewitt a tape.
That's a tough road, and even when there aren't cutbacks, it's a tough road. And there's somewhere in television that that road has got a lot of places that there are stops on the road. You go from South Bend to Chicago, and then you go to Washington, and then you come to New York, and you work locally. Stay with it. I don't want to give you too much advice because I got a daughter I got to find a job for.
Well, why don't you have her send her tape anyway? Might be some pretty good stuff.
Send your tape to Morley, and he will look at it, and he will write to you, I promise you.
Let's take our last question from Washington, D.C., WUSA. Go ahead, please.
Yes, what's your method for getting people to talk and tell their story frankly and freely without intimidating them?
Well, all I can
Sodium
do is
pentothal.
Let me tell you the answer that Morley once gave. Morley and I were at a lunch in Washington, and somebody said to him, why does someone who is so obviously a crook decide to go on 60 Minutes? And Morley said, a crook doesn't believe he's made it as a crook until he's been on 60 Minutes.
But you know, that's the hardest part of this job is to sit down with someone when you've got all of the people Mike pointed out before, 2 cameras, 2 electricians, and a sound man, 2 assistant cameramen, a producer, an associate producer, and make that person talk to you as if there's no one else in the room but the 2 of you. And to make people on who are watching on television feel that there is just the presence of the 2 people having a conversation. It's the most difficult part of this job. Last week I sat in a supermarket just off an Indian reservation and talked to a woman for 30 minutes to try to convince her to sit down for an interview. And she didn't want to do it. And she finally agreed, and I was afraid to lose her, so I rode in the car with her. And I usually don't like to spend a lot of time with people before you interview them because they tend to talk about what they're going to say and you lose it. She told me the greatest stories for 20 minutes in the car, but there was no camera in the car. And I was afraid that she wouldn't do it when we sat down, once we sat down in front of the camera. We sat down finally on her porch on the Indian reservation, and she started to talk, and she just poured out her heart. And it is, I can't describe the feeling that you get when that happens. I mean, I looked around by the end of the first roll, there were tears in my eyes because she was so good. And that is the satisfaction that you get from this job. You know, if it was a basketball game, there would have been high fives all around after the interview.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to conclude this, and I'm disappointed to do it for two reasons. One, because I think there's a lot more to talk about, but it also concludes the week that the six of you who have spent at the museum, and it's been exciting to watch you. The show is excellent, and it's solid. And as I said at one of the other seminars, you know why after you've spent some time with the six of you, because you're obviously challenged by each other. You're challenged by the demands of the show. It is so unique. It's so much one of a kind. It seems to give you an opportunity that every journalist dreams for. I remember asking the question, where do you go from here? And this is it. I mean, it's probably the best thing that you can do in journalism if you've got that opportunity. And I think it's very clear that the show is as outstanding as it is because the six of you and Harry care about it, and you work at it, and I think that you deserve every rating that you get because you work so hard at it. And it's a pleasure for the museum to, in its own little way, to pay tribute to 20 years of true excellence. And we said in our title for this series, creating a tradition, because it's just 20 years and there's a lot more to do, and none of you give the slightest impression that there's any end in sight. I'd like to thank all of you for participating this evening and for the entire week. I'd like to thank Merrill Lynch for making it possible to let more than 75 cities around the country experience what we've been doing for the past week here in New York. And I'd like to thank everybody out there for participating and for the good questions. Thank you.